I thank DCAC for organizing, for providing this space to talk about Gothic, my work. And I think that now that we are surrounded by anxieties about disease, we are in a space that is gloomy. Gothic is the fit and the best subject to talk about. This is how I see it. Now, if you are ready to be scared, then I can begin the story about Gothic. Now, Gothic is a very broad term. I have spent about 11 years, 12 years trying to learn about Gothic, and I can assure you that I still don't know much. So I'll share the screen and I'll try to use this opportunity as a way by which together you and I can make sense of Gothic. So I just inform me in case any slide is not visible, I am not audible. I am assuming this is visible, so just say yes or no.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so Gothic happens to be a very broad term, and I will follow exactly how my students do. I will follow and start with Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia tells me that Gothic is associated with Goth, that is a Germanic tribe. It is associated with medieval culture, decay, death, morbidity, terror, horror. These are the terms that are always associated with Gothic. Sensational, you will have young, virgin, wearing white color clothes, very thin, pale heroines, and at the same time, beastly villains. Not to forget red lipstick, black nail paint, and smoky eye makeup. These are how, this is how Gothic is always understood. Now, I'll move quickly to the visual history of Gothic. For this, I am borrowing from YouTube. This is something that was prepared by the UK film industry as a tribute to Gothic. So we'll just see quickly how Gothic has been represented so far. These are the pale, thin, white color wearing heroines that you will see in Gothic. Dark spaces, rooms will be dark. Oh, yes, not to forget children who are cruel. Dolls who are demonic. Vampires, mummies, the undead. This is Nosferatu. This is Dracula. And I'll get into the details later. This is when Dracula for the first time comes to London. This is our favorite Frankenstein. This is the very recent ones. Okay, so this is more or less how visually we have been seeing Gothic, the ways by which Gothic is represented in films, web series, how we understand Gothic. Now, surprisingly, Gothic as a term is associated with architecture. It is also called opus francicendum, which means French work. It's borrowed from French. And as an architecture, Gothic is always something like this. So you have thick walls, pointed arches. These are large buildings, cathedrals, large towers, ribbed walls, flying buttresses, small stained glasses and windows. Gothic as an architecture is always about this. But this is not what, for us, you and me, we start the history of Gothic from Horace Walpole. Horace Walpole's text, The Castle of Otranto, is seen as a springboard where all discussions of Gothic begin. Now, specifically speaking, again, Horace Walpole's text is inspired from his house. This is the castle. This is the castle of Strawberry Hill. Now, the entire revival of Gothic architecture does not come from the buildings that we witnessed some time ago. They were the cathedrals with stained glasses. But this theatrical house, this is almost an imitation of those medieval castles. Architecturally, then, this house is a representation of the potential of Gothic. And in literary terms, please notice the room. This room is where Horace Walpole has the dream. He is sleeping in the bedroom when he's dreaming. He sees a gigantic armored feast suddenly appearing out of nowhere. Now, this inspires him to write The Castle of Otranto. This is published in 1764. And this initiates a very powerful tradition that still now continues. I'm sure, like me, you are also fascinated by the TV series and web series and books that are published every year on Gothic. Now, there are certain key ideas that we associate with Gothic. If you notice, where are these spaces? What are the locations? They are always like Transylvania, Yorkshire, Germany, Arctic. Gothic is fascinated with strange places. Gothic fiction always seems to be working on wild and remote landscapes. These landscapes can be wide, expansive, never-ending horizons. At the same time, it can also be imprisoning. Now, think of the ending of Frankenstein. You have the wide Arctic West, and at the same time, think about how the castle in Count Dracula imprisons poor Jonathan Harker. So a nice modern young man is imprisoned in the violent, cold Central Europe. This is an archaic world. It is a sudden transformation both of the space that the characters are living in. So think about Frankenstein, think about Jonathan Harker, and also the space where these characters are moving in. It is not just strange place in terms of location, but also strange in terms of time, shift in time. So we move from the modern world to a world of typewriters, stenography. This happens very seamlessly in Bram Stoker's Dracula, recording equipment, trains, and to the world of vampires. So we move from one space to the other space. And this is a very typical of Gothic fiction. Gothic fiction always probes into the relationship between the past and the present. And this past and the present is never as a tale of evolution. It is never a tale of development, because if it were development and evolution, then it would be boring. What happens in Gothic is a sudden juxtaposition of an often violent conflict when the past erupts within the present. The past will derange the present. And one of the most powerful motives by which this happens in a Gothic tale is through ghost. So think about Wuthering Heights. The Wuthering Heights, that is Emily Bronte's novel, the ghost should be dead, but it is always vividly alive in the present. This is also true for Dracula. Now, Gothic fiction then, in Gothic fiction, death is never a cessation of life. In Wuthering Heights, you start with dead rabbits, you start with Kathy's ghost in the window, and you end with Heathcliff's ghost haunting the moors. Death is only shown to be temporary, it is never permanent. The idea is it is the everlasting life that is a curse. Condemned to live, this is one of the cursed existence and is never shown to be a blessing. The wandering living figure, so this would be the Dracula, Count Dracula. Now think about Count Dracula for a moment. He's the last member of a noble race. He is honorable. He is a reputable figure who has who defends Christianity. He is a residual figure of feudal aristocrat, and he has to be buried now because of the onslaught of modernity. Think about Frankenstein. Now, Frankenstein, I'm talking about the doctor, Frankenstein does a lot of reprehensible things, true. But he does it out of a genuine scientific curiosity. In other words, in these texts, then, readers' sympathy is not unilateral. You and I still continue to find these figures appealing. Think about Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights. These are brutal figures. He kills, he is very brutal. He kills, he's angry all the time, he beats animals and people. But at the same time, he's also a figure who is admired for not succumbing to the conventional. He does not become the boring religious Englishman, something like Linton. So, this second idea that is at the heart of a Gothic fiction is then the idea of power or authority. A Gothic fiction always has very appealing, obscenely appealing figures who are very powerful. On one hand, we have these powerful figures who embody authority, and they are always juxtaposed to figures who are vulnerable, absolute, abject, vulnerable figures. Think about Bram Stoker's Dracula. This is a romance tale. You have a damsel in distress, and the damsel is not saved by the knight. She is lured away by Count Dracula. One of the reasons why this juxtaposition happens is to question, this is how I think, is to question what is a human. Are internal desires that make us human? Or are forces from outside that compel us to do things that we do not want to do? Now, this gives an enormous space to Gothic to explore positions, say, of women, something that appears in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. So women are forced into positions and situations where they are confronted with irrational desires, transgressive desires. Jane Eyre is a text that complicates this idea because in Jane Eyre, you are not only thinking, when I use the word Gothic, you are not only thinking of Bertha Mason, but I would also want you to think about the description of Bertha Mason's face. This is how Jane Eyre describes. Take a moment and look at this description where Jane Eyre is describing Bertha Mason. Fearful and ghastly to me, I never saw a face like this. It was a discolored face. It was a savage face. I wish I could forget the roll of the red eyes, the fearful blackened inflection of the lineaments. Now, ghosts are usually pale, Jane. This, sir, was purple. The lips were swelled and dark, the brow furrowed, the black eyebrows widely raised over the bloodshot eyes. Shall I tell you of what it reminded me? It reminded her of the foul German spectre, the vampire. Now, Jane Eyre is describing here Bertha Mason. If you look how Gothic works with this idea of good and evil, we see that there is never a clear attribution of good versus evil. This distinction between good and evil is never maintained cleanly in a Gothic tale. The other example is also Byron. So Byron is often described, it's Lady Catherine Lamb, I think, yes, who describes Byron as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Byron was also the figure on which we have the first English vampire text by his doctor John Polidori. He writes Polidori's Vampire based on Byron and the figure of Byron. We then enter into the next idea that is associated with Gothic, that is of sexuality. Gothic novels give space to perverse, weird, and the dangerous. Plots will have incest, same-sex desire, violence, abduction, scenes of rape and murder. Gothic is a kind of writing that explicitly represents what is otherwise held back, say, in a Jane Austen's novel. So what you don't see in a normal domestic novel, you will always see in a Gothic text. Gothic then is fascinated with total power, obscenely patriarchal figures who have no restraints of their desires. It is also drawn to vulnerable young women. Her possible triumph over unbeatable forces. These are figures who are shown to be unbeatable, and the Gothic as a tale will try to trace now how this young woman can be saved or is saved from the man or the villain. The young, immensely beautiful heroine is always trying to run away from the tyrannical father in a Gothic text, or a beastly hero, or the ghost behind the curtain. Or a lustful monk. This is how you will always see the heroine. She'll always be shrieking. She will not be plumpy like me. She will be very thin, very pale, always wearing white. She will be crying. The control of the female body and containment of the irrational then is inextricable from the novels of this tradition. We explore wicked men, demonic figures, and while readers condemn these men, at the same time, we also feel sympathy for these figures. Gothic then has a recurring trope of what is called the forbidden knowledge, what you should not try to find. A figure like a Greek figure like the Prometheus, he's a Greek figure who steals fire from God. The biblical tale of Paradise Lost, where you have some kind of knowledge that shouldn't be available to man, anything that is forbidden to man. Or think about Frankenstein also. This is true for Frankenstein also. Only God can bring back the dead. Frankenstein tries to do that. But what is interesting in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is this is not an archaic knowledge. He does it through the new kind of knowledge that science provides. This is not necromancy that is provided. The next idea, how can we then make sense of Gothic? One category that allows us to think about Gothic is the uncanny. This is a significant term that is often useful to think about Gothic. This is Freudian idea, Freud's idea of Gothic, of uncanny. It means something that is new but takes us back to something else, either in our own psychological past or in the space that is archaic. Gothic fiction is predicated on these uncanny moments, when the reader suddenly recognizes what seems to be unfamiliar and strange is in fact an identity that is part of you and me, that is close to you and me. Figures that are not quite human are human, or figures that are not human suddenly erupt our lives. So you would have dolls, wax figures, or auto machines that are characteristic marks of the uncanny in a Gothic tale. The other way by which we try to make sense of Gothic is through the category of sublime. This is another category that allows us to think about Gothic. Sublime comes from the Latin word sublime, that means something that is not yet understood properly. Sublime is what is outside the beautiful, outside pleasurable, and at the same time, it is something that is inspiring, something that is awe, that inspires awe. It is an overwhelming presence. You are reduced to recognize that you are insignificant. Say you are in the middle of a storm, say you are in a high mountain, or standing in front of an enormous cathedral. What you are experiencing is sublime. You should see a video and then try to make sense of it. So just try to position yourself. You are here surrounded by the majestic mountains. Mountains, trees, a scene that is huge and enormous, and you remember that you are a petty mortal. Just try to imagine that you are here alone, a space like this. A scene like this is not just harmonious, uh, it's not a balanced, beautiful scene that you are here. You are too tiny in front of a majestic, and it is not a scene that is conventionally aesthetically pleasing. It is simply too majestic for you to comprehend. Now, Gothic is what pushes us to recognize this sublime. Sublime is terrifying, awe inspiring, overwhelming. It is beautiful, but at the same time, it is so majestic that you will be overwhelmingly scared. So this idea of this idea of sublime is borrowed from Burke, the experience of being reduced to insignificant in front of the mighty works of nature or wilderness, something that we witnessed now. It's more than landscape. What it moves you to recognize is that nature is far more powerful than you. Think about Prelude, Wordsworth's Prelude. So nature is there so overpowering that Wordsworth, as a tiny boy, is recoils. He coils up in sudden realization in the might of a mountain. Sublime moments of sublimity assigns human a place in the world. And Gothic recognizes that transgression, that you, the human, you are now in a wide space as a transgression. This also appears in Frankenstein also, where the framing narrative, and this is something that very often we tend to forget. Frankenstein is not just about the science or about Frankenstein and the creature. It is also about the framing narrative of Watson's letters. Now, Gothic then understands these moments of transgression between different boundaries. These moments are also what is called the moments of crisis. Moments of crisis is not just in terms of what appears in the text, but when does Gothic as a form of writing, as a genre appears. Gothic as a form particularly appears at those moments when we have a social crisis. So in 1790s, you have an enormous output of Gothic. You have a burst of Gothic writing. This is the time of great political change. You have the French Revolution in 1789, then you have the Industrial Revolution. Gothic seems to be a way of trying to make sense of these changes. The sense of doubt about the supernatural then comes from also the doubt that was emerging about religion. The idea of the satanic then that appears in Matthew Lewis the monk is important. This allows me to illustrate this. I'll use this as an example then. So in Matthew Lewis monk, you have a Satan-like figure. Now think about what kind of a Satan-like figure do you have? It is beyond the conventional Christian faith. It is more like a Promethean figure who has the right to rebel against God. Think about Milton's Paradise Lost. Now, Satan here, as Milton represents, is admirable in his resistance. It's not justifiable. I'm not saying that he is justified. It is not necessarily justified in what he's doing, but the way he's doing. Milton presents a God who dictates, who is an authoritative figure. Satan is lenient. He is heroic in his resistance, and he is a figure who shows us that it is okay to question. It is okay to not always accept order. We have to then remember that Milton himself was a revolutionary figure who despised all kinds of monarchical power and believed in a kind of religious democracy. Satan, or Milton Satan, then is then a prototype of a Gothic figure. The idea that I'm trying to repeatedly refer to then is this movement, this slip, this flusk oscillation between the supernatural and the real. In Matthew Lewis's The Monk, Satan appears at the end of the book and the protagonist is Ambrosia. He sells his soul. The other kind of figure that we see is in Anne Radcliffe's text. In Anne Radcliffe's text, it's a different thing. What appears to be a ghost is shown to be an example of misapprehension. Ghosts are explained in naturalistic terms in Anne Radcliffe's works. What I'm trying to alert you to is then two ideas of understanding Gothic. First is the trajectory that expects us to believe in the supernatural. The second is a trajectory that provides a natural explanation to it. And there are again certain variations of it also. The other variation that appears is in the American Gothic. So you have Edgar Allan Poe, who whose works have to be compared with the imperial and racial power that appears when he was writing. Now, so far, what I have been trying to explain is what is Gothic. My work is a little different, my own research work. I move from the question of what to the question of why. In my work, I try to understand why has this kind of Gothic narrative survived in the modern universe. Remember that this is a term that comes from the barbarian. This is comes from the term Goth. Gothic comes from Goth, medieval barbarian tribe who had invaded the Rome. It is a term, Gothic, also a term that is associated with mystery, superstitious, love, romance, horror, and excites the reader. But when is it that it is appearing? It is always appearing in the age of reason. It is appearing when we have scientific temperament, big discoveries being made. The appeal of Gothic, I argue then, comes from the scientific, objective, rational man of the Enlightenment. The subtext of fear always moves in terms of who is the viewer, who is the reader, what are the limits of the other. I'll explain this, but first I want you to see the shift that I am trying to alert you to. It's the ways by which we view the horror. So, one example is this, the Nosferatu. So, just have a look at it. See Nosferatu, this is Herzog's Nosferatu. Nosferatu is the vampire, also a term that appears in Bram Stoker's Dracula. The shadow, his fingers, again the young virgin, wearing white. Notice his teeth, his ears, almost a rat-like face. Pay attention to Nosferatu, how he is approaching the woman. This is Lucy. He's about to attack her and drain her blood. Pay attention to the shadows, the fingers. And the woman is drawing Nosferatu towards her. Recognize the markers of purity, sensuality. Lips are very red. We don't have blood-curdling screams here because the woman wants the vampire to suck her blood. The animalistic imagery appear here. Remember, vampire is always associated with a bat. And the animal imagery also appears when we see Nosferatu, see the body, the face, the fingers, the hands, the fang, the teeth. It is animalistic with a hint of sexuality. Again, notice she wants this animal like Nosferatu to drink her blood. She desires this. The sexual imageries are unmistakable. Now remember this, hold on to this image, and this is the next vampire that we see. This is the present vampire and the present Lucy like figure that you see. Did you notice a difference? Please say yes so that I know that I am not on a monologue alone here.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So you can see the shift, no? You see how we move from Nosferatu to. Please, anyone, do you know the name of this film?
Twilight.
Twilight, ma'am.
I know that you know better than me this. We moved from Nosferatu to Twilight. We don't have those now anymore shifts from sensuality to purity and all that. This is now outright a romantic tale. We are now in the domain of romance. Women, once upon a time, were occupying that blurred, oscillating image from the angel or the whore. Now, this entire romance and the vampire is happening inside our living rooms. The narrative is not elsewhere, it's not in a strange place, but in a high school now. It's no more in the border. This is also true even in this Dracula. So this is a Dracula, this is the later film that had appeared. From Transylvania, we are now in London. The ghost is no more, the fear is no more now elsewhere outside. The other is no more outside. The other is now inside the house. Even to some extent, if you say that Dracula is on the border of Christian Europe, by the time I take you to the next text, I want you to understand that how the other is now so close to me, so close to you. This is the next that I want you to see. Please tell me what you are seeing. Which series am I using?
The Hannibal series.
Yes. This is so different from the rat-like face of Nosferatu. See, he's so beautiful. His skin is so beautiful. He is so beautiful. His eating is far more sophisticated than me. I seem barbaric in front of him. We are not in a bloody chamber of a castle. See, this is an exquisite dining table of a modern house. This is a face of sophistication. Can you recognize how Gothic is moving then?
Yes, ma'am.
So these are all his victims. So if you see, I'm sure you know it, these are all his victims, and they are all eating human flesh. And they do it so exquisitely, so much so that even when I am always hungry when I see these things. But I know that they are human flesh. They are all eating human liver, human blood. This is human skin that he's eating, but he's eating it so stylishly that even I want to eat it. Notice his hands. They are very different from Nosferatu's hand. We don't have any more animalistic imagery. They are human. See, this is human flesh. Human flesh, the eating body, the body that is eaten, they are all same. There is a seamlessness from, we don't know who is the victim anymore. We cannot recognize. We don't have those signs. The text does not give us any signs. See, these are all, see the mouth and the flesh, they are all human. What is being eaten, what is eaten, and who is eating. And there is a sense of beauty to it. This is the last scene where the woman is fed her own leg. This is human blood. What I want you to recognize then is this question: who is the real monster? I'll just ask you a question. What is the name of monster in Frankenstein? Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? Anyone? What is the name of the monster? Huh?
It had
Dr. Frankenstein.
Yes, yes. That was a tricky question because A, the creature is unnamed, and if you read the novel carefully, it is the doctor who is presented as the real monster. Now, what I want you to understand is how these popular works of Gothic then reveal the anxieties of enlightenment, how enlightenment formulates history. The first question that I am interested in is why, in a world that claims historical truth, why do we have these tales that are so obviously supernatural and are about monsters and ghosts? And the second is, in doing so, the second question comes in. We eliminate the boundaries of what is human, underlying the uneasiness that otherwise the domestic novel seems to glorify. This also takes us to questions about novel, how writing a novel sometimes does not construct a coherent national identity. Uh, I'll give you a situation. For example, now you are in a thunderstorm, you can hear rain, you are scared, there is lightning, and you have a wax like face coming in. What do you call that face? A face that is wax, that is white? What do you call that? A face like that? You would call that face a monster, right? Suddenly, out of nowhere, a face like this comes in. What do you call this face? Anyone know what this face is? This is Queen of Elizabeth I. She always had painted her face in a wax-like image. Now, what I'm trying you to understand is how Gothic is not always what is obvious in the fearful tales, but also what remains underlying. Now, one of the assumptions that we work with is novel as a space works with linearity, logical causation, rational explanation for both human behavior and cultural progress. So this is a novel that is a space that will now move from plot, the beginning of a plot to the end of a plot. We will have a linearity in the tale. There will be a logical explanation to how characters are behaving, and that rational explanation allow me to make sense of human behavior of that point of time and the cultural progress of that point of time. Now, when I move from what is a Gothic to why is this Gothic, then it allows me to understand differently. Gothic emphasizes the irrational and the ruptures the illusion of a novel's ability to formulate uncontested subjects. When novel itself becomes the focus of the uncanny, the strange combination of the supernatural and realism, Gothic then is a unique representation. And as a literary scholar, then, my main focus is to understand how the Gothic novel portrays the idea of a human. We just now saw the shifts that it is portraying in what is it that constitutes a human, the anxieties of transmission that a human body is susceptible to. And I also try to work towards understanding how scientific empiricism occasions the supernatural, a representation of uneasiness. Now, the why question then raises, what is it that refuses to die in the past? The quest of the why should I suffer? And all Gothic novels ask this question, why should I suffer? I am a good woman, why should I suffer? I am a good man, why should I suffer? Sometimes is then has to be seen as an inversion of the family history that domestic novels portray. It is a past that refuses to lie buried, a past that erupts. Haunting is then a powerful motive in Gothic fiction. I see the novel then as inextricable as a distinct historical identity, a distinct representation that is only possible at certain age. So in 19th century, when Bram Stoker is writing Dracula, this novel was published in 1897, he's not just borrowing from Vlad the Impaler figure. He's not just borrowing myth, but he's also fusing these ideas with anxieties that were arising out of new poor laws, sanitary reforms, medical anatomist. Dracula then for me is about fear of not being in control. Remember in the Nosferatu, we were seeing constantly the woman pulling the vampire to herself. Subject of desire, where we are constantly worried about women becoming subject of desire. And that desire cannot be fulfilled in the happy married life that Jane Austen portrays. There is an explosion of desire. This idea is often understood by the Freudian notion, the return of the repressed, when our desires reappear at moments of crisis. Moments of crisis, I explain. So, revenge, these are the important tropes that keep appear. Revenge, inheritance, dreams. These are recurrent motives in Gothic. Ghost, which were on the premises, which were of origins that we do not understand, keep appearing again and again, again and again. In 18th century, this has to be understood as a return of the aristocracy, as a return of the feudal. It is an aristocracy that refuses to die when you have the emergence of the middle class. And therefore, a figure like Count Dracula cannot be buried. It remains undead. In 19th century, later half of 19th century, this comes out as a fear of the impossibility to die. The undead vampire appears when anatomist and dissections has dehumanized man. In the later age, that is our contemporary world, at the social level, how can we then respond to the evil without oneself becoming unjust and evil? How do you respond to moments of injustice without yourself becoming something what you are retaliating against? The best example of this is how, in our own moments of revolutions, to make up for the past injustice, how we sometimes become a mirror image of what we are fighting against. I want you to see this. Notice the everydayness of it. And please, I want anyone to tell me what we are seeing. Oh, I gave it away. Sorry. So this is, see the everydayness, something that you do every day. It's not unusual. It is his morning routine that is presented here when he is getting ready, cooking, taking his bath, and see the way it is represented. These are all daily actions that are presented, but see the way, and it's done very consciously. Also remember, this is a tale about a figure who becomes what he is fighting against. So what I want you to understand is how English novel is always associated with the emergence in the 18th century, the idea of the imperial project, the creation of the English subject, how English novel is always associated with these ideas. The violent eruptions of the past that we just now called as Gothic are then part of this contemporary historiographical project. The visible remnants of the violent past in the form of a Gothic story are part of this scientific temperament that seeks to accurately represent the truth. A domestic novel is a verbal equivalent of the national monument. One way of making sense of it is as a shared, ultimately self-congratulatory expression of the tale of progression that we see in Jane Austen or Dickens. A Gothic, or sometimes also Gothic tropes, disrupts this possibility that a novel can say the concrete truth. The related questions that Gothic then necessitates are the reliance of human progress, the idea that a human will now have to progress, and the second, the model of scientific empiricism to show truth. The description of a novel as a coherent linear project moving steadily towards an end. Now, this project is completely upturned, subverted, inverted by Gothic. Shifting the methodology to describe the same cultural, social, political issues, then, Gothic creates fiction based on the shared sense of identity. Remember, the other is not outside or away, but is deep within us. Fiction of homogeneity that the Enlightenment imperial project relied on to create a shared sense of Englishness, a Gothic novel disrupts. Works as a visual embodiment of ruptures. For example, this is the best example, I think. Any Jane Austen novel works with this idea that Elizabeth and Bennet and Darcy will now live forever, be happy forever. This idea of being in love forever is literally manifested when vampire desires to ingest his victims like Lucy, and Lucy desires that ingestion. The second example is marriage as a union of bodies, marriage as a union of two into one. Think about what Wuthering Heights does. It literally does that. Heathcliff digs up Cathy's grave, wants to lie buried, and eventually that is what happens. Heathcliff's desire is fulfilled. He roams in the moors with Cathy. The third is that there is a sympathetic identification with the reading audience. This is a cornerstone of any sentimental and domestic novel. This is exaggerated when it comes to Gothic novel. There is always this fear that readers might confuse Gothic to be too real. And this was one of the major criticisms of the Gothic writing that was coming up. The why question then stimulates discussions to political past, narratives of unity and cultural identity. When we see protagonists are engaged in legitimizing their identity, we interpret these texts, that is the Gothic text, in terms of moments that occasion their depiction. The Gothic discourse shows the textual ruptures in the linear tale of sentimental narratives that cover historical moments or processes. The Gothic moments pop up suddenly, and they don't want you to forget the moments of violence, murder, madness. The reaction that Gothic elicits then is a recognition that any Jane Austen novel relies on, that violence that is submerged is only an illusion. There is always a potential of physical violence to erupt. There is always a potential of sexual power and authoritative figures to erupt. Any companionate marriage novel elides over these questions. Gothic points out to these horrors that are lurking behind the narrative of a domestic novel. And Gothic does it how? Gothic shows violence first on those who are suffering, narratives of being oppressed. And second, Gothic also shows how carefully rhetoric of marriage, companionship, what is considered normal, often submerge narratives of murder or rape or violence. It is a space of fear and horror, a space of refuge. Now, there are two ways by which Gothic has always been understood, and I'm not sure if we can work with these ideas anymore. But still, these are the two ideas with which Gothic has flourished. One is horror, and the other terror. Horror is when you have a physical feeling, a physical response to scenes of cannibalism. This is a visceral response. Body is being cut off, so rape, violence. Terror is a physiological response. Now, this distinction does not survive in our contemporary universe of web series. We have films that frighten us, give us terror. One of the reasons as to I would want to believe is because we like to be tested. We want to know the extent to what we can bear the fear. And the second is we want to know what is fearful. One easy good example is also this recent web series that had come up. I don't know if you have seen. It's called Sharp Objects. It's of Amy Adams is there. Please watch if it is. The everyday is the location of the Gothic. The mother is, I'm giving the spoiler, the mother is the villain. The mother is a murderer. The typical location of a Gothic is now not a castle, remember. It's not a monastery. It's no more a barren land. This is now transposed to the known, the familiar world. The idea of the labyrinth persists. We still have darkness, threat of falling through the trapdoor. The scenario of imprisonment, fear of being alive, becomes the fear of being locked up in ourselves. This transmutation happens. We are doomed to explore ourselves. Our bodies, our lives are now the recesses that has to be dug up. One good example is this. Instead of me, I want the American Psycho to explain. And I want you to see this. Tell me if it is not visible. So,
Ma'am, it's a blank
yes,
canvas.
yes. So I'm moving towards, I am moving towards a, this. I'm going to YouTube. I want you to hear his words. So pay attention to what he's saying. Ignore the advertisement. I can do nothing about it. Is this audible?
No, ma'am, we can't hear it. Your audio. Ma'am, it's not audible.
Excuse me, ma'am, the video is not audible.
The video is not audible.
No, ma'am, no.
Oh, so he's saying that I have all the characteristics of being human. I have the skin, the nails, the face. What I don't have is the ability to feel. He sees everything around him and he says that I don't feel anything. I see faces, I don't feel anything. If you can, this is what I was referring to. Now I know that you are bored of hearing my voice, but this is the last point that I want you to pay attention to. Now, here, what we saw was the ubiquity and obviousness of violence, cruelty. Now, Gothic as a mode moves away from the psychologizing impulse of domestic novels and emphasizes corporeality. These are physical bodies that are killed, eaten, beaten, tortured. The morbid eating mutates to become an extreme form of consumption. Uh, the vampire wants to ingest and digest. In this case, a human. And this is the last idea that I want you to think about. Hold on to this idea. Is that what is very often thought to be natural and normal in the rhetoric of companionate marriages that you see in Jane Austen novels? Gothic shows that they are not very different from the violent and erotic energies that you see in the fearful tales. At the same time, Gothic is also a nourishing space. What is it? That space that allows you to be weird, you are allowed to be strange, you are allowed to be not so normal, you're allowed to question. Gothic is then I see as a nourishing space. I think I will end in this note, and then when you have questions, we can elaborate.
Thank you, Dr. Das, for the wonderfully dynamic talk on a matter that is of much consequence, not just for its politics, but also for broadening its immediate critical understandings. It is time I kindly request you to attend to the questions that our students have raised. I will read them out to you, ma'am, and you may answer them alongside.
Oh,
Swati asked a question, ma'am. She asks, how significant is transgression in the texts you have studied?
okay. So I can see the questions, so I can go one by one. So why is Gothic always elitist? Gothic is not elitist. Remember Jane Eyre? Remember Bertha Mason? Gothic is in fact the space that questions the elite narratives, questions the power hierarchy, subverts the power hierarchy, does away with who is there as the boss. Second question is how significant is trans? Okay, it is moving very fast. How significant is transgression? Transgression is important. Gothic is one of the first spaces that allows transgression, that allows what is not hegemonic. And the very term Gothic comes from there. Gothic protagonists are often powerless. No. Gothic protagonists are not powerless. In fact, we always have the conflict is a main part of the Gothic. So Gothic figures are always fighting against demons. You cannot say that they are powerless. Gothic heroines, to some extent, yes, especially in the 18th and 19th century, you have this idea of damsel in distress. But then you would have Gothic that come up later in the age that completely upturn this. Gothic also questions who embodies power, what kind of power that you are talking about. Next question. What is the difference between continental and American Gothic? It comes from the idea that I touched upon but did not elaborate, is the imperial tendencies. In British writing, the Gothic writing mainly focuses on the construction of the English subjectivity. Protagonists are usually white English figures. Those that are from the outside are the other. There is the fear and anxiety that this will now upturn and question and do away with the English national project. The tales that appear in the American Gothic, Edgar Allan Poe, you have others, Angela Carter and others, these are mainly through racial ideas of horror. Do horrors of life reflect on literature or horrors of literature reflect on life? I would argue both are true. In fact, it's very difficult to draw the difference between the two. Despite various events to define it, Gothic remains an elusive literary genre. You remind me of our English department 15-mark long questions. It is an elusive literary genre. I gave you all the different ways by which we can understand Gothic, and yet there is not one specific key. This is Gothic. There's no definition. Anything that defies the hegemonic, the normative, the heterosexual. It comes to gender. It comes to social. It comes to class. Think about Indian Gothic also. Indian Gothic, it will come to caste. Think about graphic novels. So all these are different ways by which Gothic as a genre, as a mode of writing, is always questioning what is it that is considered to be the natural and the normal. Okay. The naturalist tendencies, Gothic works with nature. One idea is how they are both related to Avinash's question as to where this idea of the body versus the mind comes in. Gothic upturns it. Gothic completely upturns the Cartesian determinism that the mind is the seat of thinking. Gothic makes the body as the repository, the main premise of the tale. So it is not the mind that is feeding them, it is the body that is feeding. It is your physical body that is drained of blood. It is the physical body that is tortured and beaten and killed and murdered and raped. These are so the reverse is also true. Elizabeth Bennet, you fall in love through letters, you fall in love through words. Here in Gothic novel, you fall in love through the body. It is the body that is always the focus. Next question, the idea of castle, it comes from the Horace Walpole. I started with this idea. Remember the Strawberry Hill? Gothic is also associated with architecture. Next question, is there any specific term? Yes, it is called sublime. How can we see body horror? Don't feel discouraged. Go to Netflix. There are enormous amount of new works that are being done. In case if you're interested to read David Punter's work, Fred Botting work. Then you have Kelly Huxley, Huxley. In terms of Gothic and clothes, you have Catherine Spooner. There is a website, it's called International Gothic Association. Go to their webpage. You will have beautiful works on Gothic, contemporary discussions and research that is being done. You want me to explain Jane Austen's novel? Jane Austen's novel is, I'm using Jane Austen novel as an embodiment of the domestic novel and how Gothic exaggerates those embodiments. and subverts the potential that appears in Gothic. Gothic is always understood as an other to the domestic novel. Jane Austen is the, the example of the domestic novel. How significant establishing Gothic architecture? We borrow from Gothic architecture the idea of castle, the idea of, so from a physical space, we are moving to the psychological impulse, to the psychological idea of the space, from the dark and gloomy space, the subterranean, the labyrinth that appeared in terms of the tunnels now becomes the labyrinths of the mind. Think about how Hannibal is plotting. Think about how the vampire is paying the mind games. How, in fact, one of the powers of the vampire is to occupy the mind reading, what is called. What are the examples of Asian continental Gothic? One beautiful example is the recent film Bulbul. Did anyone of you see it? So there are many examples of Gothic. There are many examples of Indian Gothic. There are also one beautiful example of how, in Indian context, Gothic does not necessarily follow the tendencies that we see in English novel is of Satyajit Ray movie. There's this Gupi Bagha series that comes in, where the ghost is a friend, it's called the Bhuter Raja, the king of the ghost, is a friend of the protagonist. So a lot of time Gothic is not always fearful, but always also serves a social purpose. So there's a way by which the shifts are happening. How does it, next question? What is, okay, so, okay, any more questions? Workings as maintaining the genre. White Sargasso Sea by Jean Rees. These actually work with how they take tendencies of Gothic and rewrite a Gothic tale. So if you read Sargasso Sea and see, Bertha is made no more the victim. Bertha is, instead of Jane Eyre, the novel being told from the point of view of the Jane Eyre, we now have Bertha Mason saying the story. It's a beautiful way of subverting the Gothic. How does Gothic literature celebrate the breakdown of normative discourse, the return of the repressed? The Gothic does, yes, the Gothic celebrates everything that is non-normative. It is a space, even within domestic novels, you have those tiny eruptions of the disrupted, tiny return of what is sometimes effaced and forgotten. The anxieties of transmission. Okay, one easy example, I'll give you an example. This is something that I'm borrowing from my own PhD work. We always fear that the virus and bacteria can infect my body. Vampire narratives work with this anxiety. It is how bodies are contaminated. You move from one body to the other body through the exchange of fluid. It is not the miasma vapor, it is not a bacteria and virus that is contaminating agent anymore. It is the human body, the human blood that is now the source and the fear of anxiety and also the agent of transmission. In other words, the human body is, with its pores, is now susceptible. It is not anymore the consolidated, stable, concrete body that we are noticing, but rather these are fluid bodies, conceptually fluid that are open to disruptions, constantly opening up. Gothic as a narrative then works with this idea of how easily it's not the house that can be punctured, it's not the house that I can invade, it is also the protagonist body that I can invade. Any other questions that you have?
If there are no more questions, okay, so
There's a long
if there are no more questions, that gets us to the end of the Q&A session as well. I invite our core team member, Kushi Sharma, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Rajat. I wish to thank our keynote speaker, Dr. Das, for agreeing on having this interactive session with us. I also hereby thank our college principal, Dr. Gupta, for giving us the opportunity to conduct this keynote session as part of Pantheon 2021. My gratitude also to Dr. Banerjee, our teacher in charge, without whose guidance the event would not have been a success. I thank the FAC and the faculty members for their support, and without question, my core team, whose efforts have animated the fest and turned the session into an achievement. Let me also express my heartfelt gratitude to the audience members for their thorough involvement. With this, I call an end to the first half of our fest